we're going to go to Q&A, where we would love to have you share questions, comments, suggestions, ideas, concerns, enthusiasms. Austin, Matthew, anything else that we want to say, or just encourage parents? How do you want to encourage parents at this point?
Yeah, we just want to thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for giving us that research. You know, this is such a huge topic. For me, I've struggled with mental health. I grew up in a traumatic situation, and like you said, it's important to talk about it and talk to our kids about it.
Yeah.
Keep this under wraps. I love what you said. We were talking about, you know, what we do so many times. Henry Cloud talks about this, and he says that so many times in the church we tell people pray and read scripture, which is great, but that actually loads people up like a Pharisee. We put a heavier load on people.
Yeah.
We don't allow people to talk about this. What we really need to heal is community and relationships. Our capacity to heal, our capacity to destroy one another is only matched by our capacity to heal one another in relationships.
Powerful. That's really powerful, Matthew. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's, God's made us as communal people. God in God's image is three people. So, I mean, fundamentally who God is God is three gods in community, basically three forms of God in community. So yes, God has designed us to be in community, and that is almost always involved in our healing and growth. So absolutely, good point. Yeah, Kathy, I love what you're saying here about how we can have more conversation and freedom about mental health. And let me just say, Matthew, you just modeled it, because you said, I deal with this also. And so you've just now made it even more discussable for us. And so for us as parents, to create an environment in our home where we can talk about our struggles. Now, we don't have to emotionally vomit all over our kids. But, you know, Matthew, you modeled it really well. You mentioned it. You gave us a hint of your background, enough to know that we could connect with you on that. And then we're able to talk about it more freely. So hats off to you, Matthew. You did that wonderfully. And that's what we want in our churches, that in sermons, in small groups, around dining room tables, around coffee tables in homes, that we're able to talk about this. So great. So Matthew, Austin, should folks just chat in questions? Is that, would that be the best thing?
Yeah, just go rapid fire, chat in a question. We'd love to hear from you. And again, all that stuff you said, Kara, I loved it. It was so good. I'm way too transparent. Breathing, all that's actually stuff in the pandemic. I've struggled with my mental health, and all those techniques you talked about are things that I've been doing in my own life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I just spoke at a youth leader gathering this week, a National Nazarene conference, where they had somebody talk about teenage mental health like I did, and then I followed up talking about youth leader mental health. Which is, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about here is very relevant for us as parents. So absolutely. Jenna, I think your point about how mental health can also be linked to increase in teenagers and young children having easy access to porn. I don't know the data on that, but that certainly wouldn't surprise me. And that is a concern that I have about the pandemic is I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see a huge uptick from this last year in porn use for all ages, and especially our young people. When children share that they are at a 4 or 5, I assume it's on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you start the conversation? Great question, Ramona. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. It's such a beautiful name. Sorry if I'm saying it a little inaccurately. Well, then I'll tell you what I did with our child who said that they were at a 5. I did offer therapy, like I said. Just so that, hey, if you ever want to talk to anybody else. And then we talked about, when you struggle, what are some things that you can do? And this is one of our kids who really loves worship music. And so this child wants to focus more on worship music in those times. This child also feels better when they go outside. And so we talked about how that can be a helpful coping mechanism. So at that 4 or 5, I think it's it's peeling back the layers a little bit and seeing what kind of coping strategies do they have. Do they need some additional ones? And I gotta say, at a 4 or 5, I think that that child can also see a therapist. If it's I'm such an advocate for all people seeing therapists at some point, to become more self-aware, to understand God's healing and work in our life. So 6 is where we for sure recommend it, as we've talked to therapists, but any number can certainly benefit from therapy. Evelyn, I love your question. What are some potential warning signs that a child is really struggling with anxiety? Here's what's interesting about mental health is it's often more or less of something. So if they're eating more or eating less, those could be warning signs. If they're sleeping more or sleeping less, those can be warning signs. If they're pulling away from things that they have done in the past that have bring them enjoyment, those are warning signs. If they're overly indulgent in those things that have brought them joy in the past, those are warning signs. So this is where we just kind of got to know our kids. And I will just say, as a parent, anything out of the ordinary, I want to file away and maybe investigate, whatever that looks like. Whether the investigation looks like a conversation with my kid, that's what I hope it usually is. But or whether that means I'm going to monitor their cell phones a little bit more closely, check their texts, make sure I'm following them on social media so I see what they're posting and all that. So really, I would say anything that causes you to be concerned, pay attention to. And this is where, again, during the pandemic, we parents are seeing our kids far more than the typical adult is. So, and this is especially for kids at risk. And kids from particularly toxic homes. It's often been teachers and coaches and pastors who've been that wraparound support for them. And in the pandemic, a lot of that has been removed or cut in half. And so this is where we as parents, we need to be extra diligent with our own kids and our other kids that we're aware of, and help our kids talk to us about other kids. Because that teacher, that pastor, who might normally catch signs, if they're not around them as much, it's hard to see those signs. And I know North Carolina is more open than California is, so I know that you're seeing kids more, but you're not seeing them as much as you were 14 months ago, I bet. And so still, we as parents, we need to be extra diligent. Can I explain a little bit more about how technology is linked to mental health? Yeah, absolutely. There's all sorts of ways that it is and could be connected. Part is the type of content that we've talked about, whether that's porn or whether that's just a bunch of messages that make a young person feel inadequate about themselves, that they go on to TikTok and everybody looks better than them. Everybody has a nicer house than them. So there can be that feeling of kind of inferiority. There can also be FOMO, this fear of missing out, that gosh, everybody seems to be at the beach or at a park or doing something, and I'm here by myself in my room. Nobody invited me to go. That can be really crushing for a young person. So those are just a couple of the examples about how technology is linked to mental health. And again, I'm very pro technology. I try to use technology in ways that build my mental health, that build my kids' mental health, that keep us more connected as a family. So this is where we need to be really sensitive. Do we need to take phones from our kids at night? I recommend for sure through middle school that a middle schooler does not sleep with their phone in their room, and even early high school. Later high school, I feel like you're transitioning to the kid becoming more on their own. And so you want to help them make better choices. But if you're concerned, or just as a general rule, I would say, feel free to have everybody's phone, or everybody but yours for emergencies, be charged and housed in your kitchen at night, something like that. So those are some of the ways that technology's linked to mental health. Facebook has an interesting documentary called The Social Dilemma. Have any of you seen The Social Dilemma? Yeah, I highly recommend it for parents to watch, and ideally for parents to watch with their kids. Even a half hour of it. I think it's about 90 minutes, but even a half hour will get you thinking about how technology is affecting you. It's a little conspiracy-ish, okay? So like take it, like most things, take it with a grain of salt, but it's a great discussion starter for you with your kids. Fightthenewdrug.com. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jenna, for that resource for parents regarding pornography. When I ask how my daughter's feeling, I get one response is fine, good. Are there any ways to get her open a little more? Okay. I haven't shared this story before because it's only 4 days old. But with the child with our kid that we talked to this weekend about mental health, we gave them a warning 3 or 4 days before. We said, hey, sometime this weekend, we want to have a real talk about how you're doing. We can do it at home. We can drive to a Starbucks and get a drink and talk in the car. Like however, whenever, wherever you want to have this conversation, we want to know how you're really doing. And you know, and if Starbucks sweetens the deal, literally and metaphorically, then that's fine. And so this child ended up wanting to do it on Saturday. So we hung out in our family room. They didn't want to do anything, you know, they didn't need a Starbucks. They just wanted to hang out in our family room. And so we talked about it. And this is something that I say to my kids, if a conversation isn't, I mean, sometimes your kid just doesn't want to talk to you and you need to honor that. Absolutely. But you know, this was the time that our child had said they wanted to talk about this, and it still wasn't really unfolding. And so I said, well, you know, if this isn't a good time, then we can loop back to it later. If you're not ready to talk about it, then we can talk about it some other time this weekend. And, you know, that was the last thing the child wanted to do, is have to do this again. And so I just gave away the gender. It's one of my kids at home. That's pretty obvious by now. And so she said, no, it's okay. We can talk about it now. And she like opened up more. So I think there's some principles that I found helpful in working with young people or in parenting young people. You give them a sense of agency. She felt like she could choose when we were having the conversation. If it's not going well, you offer to take a break and then return. Again, most of the time, my kids, if I don't feel like they're being honest, and this feels like a time when they could and should be honest and they aren't being honest, then I'll say, well, let's push pause on this and we can come back to it. And normally they're like, no, let's keep going. And they open up at least a little bit more. So Amber, I would also say that's where the feelings wheel can be helpful. I'd also say this is a little different, a different approach than what I said about letting your kid choose, but look for windows that are not costly to the kid for a good conversation. So over meals, because you're having, you know, hopefully at least some nights of the week sitting together anyway, that's a good time to have that conversation when you're in the car, etc. I find my kids are more open to conversation if it doesn't take them away from their friends. So Dave and I look for those times to have conversations like that. So at work as a teacher, we report suicide. What do we do if someone in the community says they are 8 or so? You know what? Fantastic question, Claudia. And that's not one that I feel equipped to answer because I don't know how North Carolina handles that. So I would say, you know, if you're a teacher, then you talk to your supervisor, and you're probably a mandated reporter. And so you might need to, but the good news, two pieces of good news. If you're in that position wondering if you should report something, number one, you might have a supervisor you can talk to, or a pastor or a teacher. You can make it anonymous. Hey, I'm concerned about this kid, blah, blah, blah. The other thing, and I have done this before, you can actually call the Child Protection Services hotline and anonymously describe what's going on and get their perspective. So there are ways to get feedback from professionals, either people in your context or people from your state, city government that can advise you. So I think probably a lot more of us are mandated reporters than we might realize.
And I can talk to that. They are mandated reporters. We tell all our youth workers, if you're working with a student and they tell you that that's something they're struggling with, you need to tell us immediately, because that's serious.